Nestled within the West Virginia mountains lies a cemetery where the headstones tell a tale that defies nature itself. The dates carved there don't add up. In impossible ways, the names repeat. And if you follow the family lines etched into that weathered stone, a discovery awaits that will freeze the blood in your veins. This goes far beyond simple inbreeding. This is more than mere isolation. This is the story of a woman who carried a child for her own grandson, and the corrupted bloodline that spawned one of America's most horrifying family secrets. Hello everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel before we begin, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. That's how YouTube knows to keep feeding you stories exactly like this one. The truth I'm about to share was buried for more than 100 years. The witnesses were silenced, the records were hidden, and the truth was locked away in courthouse basements and family Bibles that nobody dared to open. I found it, though, and after you hear this story, the reason some secrets were meant to stay buried will become terribly clear to you. Her name was Betty, and she lived down in the hollow, a place where the ground barely saw the sun, where families had intermarried for so many generations that their children were born with ancient-looking faces, with eyes that seemed to hold knowledge no child should possess, and with hands trembling from the burden of generations of genetic decay. But Betty's story plunges far deeper than that, much deeper. The year was 1887, and the West Virginia mountains formed a world of their own. No roads led into or out of Cane Creek Hollow. No strangers ever visited. The family's dwelling there had been cut off for close to a century, their bloodlines so entangled that charting their family trees was like solving a puzzle where every single piece was the wrong shape. A curse was already written into Betty's bones from the moment she was born. Her grandparents were siblings, her parents were first cousins, and her great-grandparents, well, the records turn murky there, because some truths were too dark even for the family Bible. Before Betty even took her first breath, the genetic burden of 5 generations of inbreeding was already upon her. But this is what the historians refuse to tell you. This is what they buried deep in those courthouse records. Betty was more than just a victim of this twisted family tree, she became its architect. Something inside her fractured as she grew from a girl into a woman, in a way that genetics alone can never explain. It was as if the very mountains had poisoned her soul, transforming her into something that existed beyond all boundaries of human decency. The initial signs emerged when she was 14. The other Hollow children would whisper about how Betty's eyes would track her male relatives in a manner that made their skin crawl. How her touches would linger too long, how she would stand too close, how she would smile in ways that promised things blood relatives should never promise one another. The old women of the Hollow recognized what they were witnessing, but they also knew that speaking of it would only invite more darkness into their already cursed existence. Betty had already birthed her first child by the time she was 16. Her uncle was the father. But that was merely the opening chapter of a story that would make the most hardened investigators question everything they believed about the depths of human depravity. The Hollow lived by its own rules, its own twisted logic that made sense only to those who had never known any other way of life. Yet even by those standards, what followed defied all comprehension. Betty's first child, a boy she named Samuel, entered the world bearing the unmistakable signs of severe inbreeding. His skull was misshapen, his eyes were set too close together, and his fingers were webbed, as if an ancient curse had been made flesh. But when Betty looked upon that child, she saw something else entirely. She saw opportunity. She saw the continuation of a bloodline that had become so concentrated, so pure in its corruption, that it had transcended normal human boundaries. And as Samuel grew from infant to toddler to young boy, Betty began to groom him for a role no child should ever be prepared for. The Hollow's isolation worked to her advantage. There were no churches, no schools, no outside authorities to question the events behind the walls of that ramshackle cabin. Samuel's entire world became Betty, as she taught him that the love shared by family members knew no boundaries, that what other families had was weak and diluted compared to the pure devotion flowing through their own bloodline. The other families in the Hollow had started to notice changes in Betty's behavior by the time Samuel was 12. She had grown possessive of the boy in ways that made even the most hardened mountain folk deeply uncomfortable. She refused to let him work in the fields with the other men. She wouldn't allow him to play with other children. Instead, she kept him constantly at her side, whispering secrets into his ear that drained the color from his young face with understanding. Stories passed down from their grandparents, remembered by the old-timers, told of strange noises emanating from Betty's cabin late at night. Noises that weren't quite singing and weren't quite crying, but something in between that made the hair on your arms stand on end. They remembered how Samuel's eyes began to gleam with the same predatory light as his mother's, and how he eventually stopped looking at other people altogether, as if Betty had become the only person in his world who mattered. A journal discovered in 1962, hidden within the walls of the old cabin during its demolition, documents what transpired when Samuel turned 15. The entries were in Betty's own handwriting, and they reveal a mind that had plunged so far into madness she believed she was conducting a sacred ritual, preserving what she called the pure blood of her lineage. The journal speaks of ceremonies performed beneath the full moon, where Betty would recite her ancestors' names and speak of her duty to continue their work. She wrote of how the outside world had been corrupted by mixed bloodlines, how only families like hers understood the true power that came from keeping the blood concentrated and undiluted. But most disturbing of all were her writings about Samuel, whom she described not as her son, but as her destiny. The neighbors began to observe a change in Samuel. His shoulders had broadened, his voice had dropped, but his mind appeared to be regressing. He spoke in fragments, in half-sentences that sounded like incantations or prayers. At dawn and dusk, he would walk the boundaries of their property, moving in patterns that suggested ritual rather than exercise, and always, without fail, Betty was watching him with eyes blazing with a hunger that stretched far beyond maternal affection. The inevitable occurred on a winter night in 1904. Betty was 33, and Samuel was 17. The journal entry from that night is scrawled in a trembling hand, but the words remain clear enough to chill your blood. Betty wrote of completing the circle and achieving the perfection God had intended. She wrote of Samuel coming to her not as a son, but as the culmination of everything their bloodline had been building toward. Then, 9 months later, Betty gave birth to a daughter, a child who was simultaneously Samuel's daughter and his sister. Betty's granddaughter and her own daughter. The family tree hadn't merely been twisted, it had been knotted in a way that defied every law of nature and decency. Sarah was the name given to the child born of this unholy union. And from her very first breath, it was clear that something fundamental within her genetic code had shattered. She was born with features so distorted that even the hardened midwife who delivered her crossed herself and whispered prayers for forgiveness. Her limbs were twisted, her skull was severely malformed, and her eyes held a vacancy that suggested the soul behind them had been damaged beyond all repair. But Betty looked upon this broken child and saw triumph. In her warped mind, Sarah represented the ultimate achievement of her bloodline's purity. She had created something that existed nowhere else on earth, a being whose genetic heritage was so concentrated that she embodied generations of accumulated traits in a single, twisted form. Sarah was the perfect vessel, Betty wrote in her journal, the key to unlocking the final mystery. If you're still watching, your bravery already surpasses that of most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. The other families in the hollow began giving Betty's cabin a wide berth entirely. They would take longer routes to avoid her property, and they forbade their children from playing anywhere near the creek that ran behind her land. Those few who caught glimpses of Sarah would whisper about a child who didn't seem entirely human, whose cries sounded more like the calls of a wounded animal than those of an infant. Samuel, meanwhile, had become something barely recognizable as the boy he once was. The trauma inflicted by his mother, combined with the genetic damage he carried, had left him in a state of permanent mental regression. He would spend hours sitting on the cabin's front porch, rocking back and forth while staring at nothing, occasionally mumbling words that might have been names or might have been pure nonsense. But Betty was not finished. As Sarah grew from an infant to a toddler, Betty began to speak of her plans for the child's future. She talked of Sarah eventually giving birth to children who would be even more perfect, even more pure. And when people asked who the father would be, Betty's smile would take on that same predatory gleam that had marked the beginning of this nightmare decades before. The true horror of Betty's vision began to reveal itself as Sarah reached her 5th birthday. The child could barely walk. Her speech was incomprehensible, and her behavior swung between periods of complete catatonia and violent outbursts that required both Betty and Samuel to restrain her. But in Betty's increasingly fractured mind, these were not signs of genetic catastrophe. They were proof that Sarah had transcended normal human limitations. The journal entries from this period descend into pure madness. Betty wrote of receiving visions from her ancestors, of how they appeared in her dreams and told her that Sarah was the chosen vessel who would birth a new kind of human being. She described elaborate rituals performed over the child, covering her in symbols drawn with ash and blood, whispering incantations in a language that seemed part dialect and part something else entirely. The other families in the hollow had reached their breaking point. Led by the eldest patriarch, a man named Ezekiel who claimed to have seen enough darkness for several lifetimes, they gathered one autumn evening to discuss what they called the Betty problem. These were not people who scared easily. They had endured years of isolation, poverty, and their own genetic nightmares. But the events in that cabin by the creek had crossed a line they could no longer ignore. The decision they reached that night was as final as it was brutal. They would offer Betty one last chance to leave the hollow voluntarily, taking her broken family with her. If she refused, they would take matters into their own hands. Ezekiel himself delivered the threat, walking to Betty's cabin on a morning when the fog hung so thick you couldn't see your own feet. Betty's response was to laugh. According to Ezekiel's later testimony, it wasn't the laugh of someone who had lost her mind. It was the laugh of someone who believed she held all the power. She told him that forces he could never comprehend protected her family. That Sarah's destiny was already written in blood and starlight, and that anyone who tried to interfere would face consequences echoing through generations. What happened next depends on who you ask, but the facts carved into the cemetery stones do not lie. On the night of November 15, 1909, a fire consumed Betty's cabin while she, Samuel, and 6-year-old Sarah slept inside. The official cause was listed as an overturned lantern, but the positioning of the bodies told a different story. They were found huddled together in the center of the main room, as if they had been waiting for something rather than trying to escape. Ezekiel's grandson, interviewed shortly before his death in 1987, claimed his grandfather confessed the truth on his deathbed. The fire was no accident. The men of the hollow had decided that some bloodlines were too corrupted to continue, that some secrets were too dangerous to survive. They had surrounded the cabin in the dead of night and set it ablaze, standing guard to ensure no one escaped to spread their genetic poison to other communities. But here is where the story takes its final, most disturbing turn. When they were clearing the ruins 3 days later, they found something that should not have existed. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been Betty's bedroom, they discovered a wooden box containing dozens of carefully preserved samples, hair, teeth, and other biological materials from every member of the bloodline going back 5 generations. Alongside these gruesome trophies was a detailed breeding chart that mapped out not just what had already happened, but what Betty had planned for the future. The chart showed Sarah's projected offspring, calculated with mathematical precision to produce what Betty called the ultimate convergence. But most chilling of all, it showed Betty's own name at the center of a web that connected her to every other family member in ways which suggested her relationship with Samuel was only the beginning of a much larger, more systematic plan. The box and its contents were buried in an unmarked grave outside the hollow's boundaries, and the men who buried it swore an oath to never speak of what they had seen. But secrets have a way of surviving, even when the people who keep them do not. And somewhere in those West Virginia mountains, in a cemetery where the headstones still tell their twisted tale, Betty's legacy continues to whisper its dark truths to anyone brave enough to listen. The bloodline ended that night in 1909, but the questions it raises about the price of absolute isolation and the depths of human depravity remain unanswered. Some boundaries, once crossed, can never truly be uncrossed.